Students from my in-person philosophy classes know that often I'll mix in some martial arts or some self-defense just to lighten the mood and just for fun. And so today I thought, as we talked about Rosalind Hursthouse, virtue theory and abortion, as well as Ed Langerak's abortion, listening to the middle, I teach you just some basic martial arts techniques. So first of all, and it's a little bit cold in my garage, so forgive the pink nose and the pink fist as well. And thanks so much to my partner today, Spar Pro / Bob Dummy. So first of all, the basic boxing 1-2. And so if you're right-handed, you begin with your left foot forward as well as your left hand forward. And you're going to extend your left hand out like this. That's the 1. And the 2 is your right hand, which will come forward as your left retracts. So it's 1, 2 like this. And if you breathe when you do this, you'll oxygenate your brain. Sometimes when folks get in a fight or a self-defense situation, they'll hold their breath, which makes it more difficult or makes it much easier to knock them out and more difficult to fight because you need oxygen for your muscles and your brain to work. So if you remember to exhale as you throw these strikes, that'll help. So like that. On your opponent, looks like this. And you can follow it up with a 3, which is a hook like this. So. All right, so Hursthouse. Hursthouse wants to distinguish, and she does a decent job of distinguishing virtue theory from deontological and consequentialist approaches to ethics. A deontological approach would set up some sort of a rule based on, in some cases, divine command theory. You might say, God says you must do this, and then you take that particular rule, it translates into a particular action. In contemporary secular ethics, this is typically based on rationality. So you've got this obligation to behave in a rational fashion, which generates an obligation to take some course of action, which leads to the actual action. You might think of Kantianism, of course. You've got the categorical imperative. You should only do things that you could universally will from a rational perspective. From the consequentialist approach, you're going to attempt to bring about the best consequences, which is typically cashed out in terms of happiness. And when it comes to utilitarianism, of course, the mandate is to maximize net pleasure, bring about the most happiness overall. But the virtue ethics approach is distinct from these two other approaches, which are also distinct from one another, in that you begin with a virtuous character, which leads to a virtuous motivation or a virtuous mindset, and virtuous action, which leads to human flourishing. It's going to lead to a good life for both you and for others around you if you're in a society of folks who are practicing the virtue ethics approach. So that's the basic contrast. She defends virtue ethics against a list of criticisms. She does it very, very quickly and makes it clear that it would take an entire book to do a good job of this. But all these criticisms, I think of all of them, I think the most difficult and the most challenging one is that it's difficult in many cases to determine which virtue to follow. Virtue ethics in general says you should practice the virtues, avoid the vices, but in some cases you've got various competing, it would seem, virtues that would recommend various courses of action. And so it's unclear what you should actually do. Well, Hursthouse says, okay, fine, this is a problem, but it's not a problem unique to virtue ethics. She argues that if you're applying Kantianism, a deontological approach, for example, it's not always clear what only doing something which could be universalizable, which particular maxim you articulate and run through the universalizability test. It's not always clear which maxim is appropriate in a particular case. And so that's another problem, or a problem that's very similar to their problems. You can't just criticize virtue ethics for having that issue. The same is true for consequentialist or utilitarian approaches. Sometimes it's unclear which course of action will bring about the most pleasure overall. And so that there's a little bit of difficulty in applying virtue ethics. Okay, fine, it's difficult sometimes, but that's not specific to virtue ethics, and so therefore it's just as good as the others, or they're just as bad, I suppose. She then takes virtue ethics in this approach and applies it, of course, to a particular issue, which is, of course, abortion. And she argues that abortions are always a serious matter. There have been applied ethicists who have argued that having an abortion should not be taken seriously from a moral perspective, that it's akin to having your appendix removed or having a haircut. Hursthouse says that even if you think that persons have a moral right, so for example, Margaret Olivia Little, consistent with Judith Jarvis Thompson, argues that we enjoy no absolute right to life, which implies that women are fully within their moral rights to have abortions because there's no requirement that we do anything and everything that we could to maintain a life. And so Hursthouse wants to say that even if it's the case that it's fully within your rights to have an abortion, that doesn't settle the issue for virtue ethics. Virtue ethics sets a higher standard. It's more demanding than would be a basic rights theory. And so she wants to argue that it's always a serious matter. It's never like a mere appendectomy or a haircut. And this is because when it occurs, a human life ends. She says that you don't need a fancy philosophical understanding of the metaphysics of unborn developing human, whether it's a partial person or a potential person or a full person. You don't need that, and you don't need to wait on some fancy applied ethicist to come up with an articulation of what that metaphysical status should be to know that a human life ends, and that's something that ought not be taken lightly. She says that those who consider abortions on par with a haircut or an appendectomy, they should be criticized as being callous, as light-minded, as being juvenile, as being lacking in the sort of wisdom that only comes with age and experience. And she doesn't mean experience in terms of having an abortion, but she does suggest that going through the experience of having a child, or at least being a parent allows a person to better appreciate the status and the value of an unborn developing human. Now, even though she says it should always be taken seriously, and it's never something to be treated trivially, she says that there are circumstances in which it would be, all things considered, morally best to have an abortion. And she says specifically, or she cites specifically, a case where it would be very physically burdensome, and it might impact the woman's ability to earn a living. So she uses the example of being, I think, a coal miner in the 19th century, and if you were to become pregnant, she thinks that it would definitely be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to continue your profession and be able to take care of yourself and your existing family if you were to maintain a pregnancy. But she says that even if an abortion were excusable, and again, all things considered best in this case, that doesn't mean that it should be cast aside. She thinks it would still be something that would be worthy of both remorse and perhaps guilt, because it indicates that you put yourself in a situation where you're pregnant and you know, or you should have known on the front end, that you wouldn't be able to maintain and take care of that pregnancy, and going through with abortion would require the ending of a human life. So she says that this would generate an appropriate response of even remorse and as well as guilt. And she says that further, it's essential to human flourishing that people have children, that they become parents. And she says that individuals who seek abortions, and this also applies to men who would request abortions from their sexual partners, she thinks that if a person has an abortion because they don't want to become a parent, she says this can indicate that they are shallow, that they are overly materialistic, and that if they think that they need to wait until conditions are perfect to have children, that they're being foolish, because conditions will never be perfect. All of what she says also applies to both boys and men, so it's not just an argument that would apply to women. So that's Hursthouse, Virtue, Ethics, and Abortion. Before the next article, a basic martial arts principle is high line, low line. So say you are defending yourself against an assailant, you start doing the 1-2, hitting them in the head, then they start defending that. You can switch up your attack from high to low. So say, rather than doing the 1-2, you're throwing some elbows to your head, and they begin to block those elbows. Well, you can switch from throwing elbows to clinching and throwing a few knees. You go to the groin, you go to the leg, up into the sternum, whatever. In boxing, punch up here, come down low, go to the body a few times, and come back up to the head. Can't defend everything at the same time. So switch it up, they block, you go here, they block here, you go there. High line, low line. All right, Edward Langerak's Abortion, Listening to the Middle. Langerak gives voice and rational defense to what he considers a reasonable perspective and a widely shared view that later term abortions are more difficult to justify than early term abortions. And he thinks this is something that is based on an intuitive endorsement of a couple of different things. And first, he thinks that the potentiality of the unborn developing human to become a full person like the rest of us gives it high moral status. And he wants to say that this high moral status is that we give to a potential or give to an unborn developing human is consistent with the sort of value we give to a elected president who is yet to take actual office. So the election occurs in November. They actually take office in January. And there's something special about an elected president before they become the actual president. And that is if the country doesn't dissolve and if that person doesn't die, they will become president. He thinks that that is similarly true about an unborn developing human after especially implantation occurs. So if you have a sperm and an egg separately, they could possibly become a person, just like you or I could possibly become president. But once the sperm and the egg conjoin, and especially once they implant in the uterine wall, now there's a very high chance, or at least there's a very good chance, that they'll become an actual person like the rest of us. Now, he cites statistics on spontaneous abortions or miscarriages. People argue whether or not this happens 15% of the time, up to 50% of the time. It could be greater. But he says that, look, if we take a look at the other end of life, in adults who are perhaps in a coma, if there were a 15% chance or a 50% chance or even a 5% chance that they would come out of the coma, we would be very disinclined to, say, pull the plug and allow them to go ahead and die completely. And so if there's a 5 or a 15 or a 50% chance that an unborn developing human, once the sperm and the egg meet, and especially when they implant in the uterine wall, if that's got that good of a chance that they become a full person, well, then they have that high moral status and should be treated with much respect and such. And he thinks that over the course of pregnancy, this potentiality becomes greater and greater. And so he mentions 4 different stages. There's implantation in the uterine wall. There's what he calls the quickening. That's when he says around the end of the second trimester, the unborn developing human can spontaneously move on its own. It can interact with the mother, etc. Then he also says that another stage that has moral significance is viability. That's when the UDH can survive outside of the womb with little medical intervention. And then last he says at birth. That's the other morally relevant stage, where the likelihood that the entity will become a full person increases, and therefore its moral status increases, and the difficulty in justifying an abortion would also increase. The other side of his argument is that if we allow abortions for trivial reasons later in pregnancy, this undermines the value and our respect for human life in general, and in particular, our respect and valuation of adolescent life, the life of young children, especially birthed babies, because he argues that in the third trimester and later in pregnancy, there's little physical difference between birthed baby and the unborn developing human. And so if you allow third trimester or late term abortions for whatever reason, it would be logically consistent to also allow infanticide for similar reasons. And if you don't want to justify abortion or infanticide or killing of birth babies for whatever reason, you wouldn't allow the same reason to apply to an abortion while it's still in utero. All right, so that's Hursthouse and Langerak. One last technique. This is a favorite finishing technique of mixed martial artists. I've used it a few times in the jiu-jitsu gym. It's called the rear naked choke. Man, heard of it? Get behind your opponent like this. You're going to wrap your arm around their head like so. You want the bend of your elbow to be right here in the middle of their throat. You're going to take this hand and put it in your other elbow like this, or inside this elbow, and put this hand on the back of their head and squeeze. Now notice I'm not placing my forearm on their trachea. You don't want to crush their windpipe and cause them to suffocate. This is a blood choke, or more appropriately, a strangulation. So you're cutting off the blood flow to and from the brain, which is going to make them lightheaded and eventually go to sleep if they don't tap out. So wrap around like that. Squeeze, close your eyes, put your head down so they can't poke you in the eye. Langerak, Hursthouse, and abortion. Hope you enjoyed.